there are well-known figures here, the Martin Lees of Hong Kong, who are regarded with great anathema by Peking. Are you saying that you would not happily, knowingly do a deal of a kind which would have Martin Lee, presuming he were very probably going to be elected in 95, turfed off the train in 97?
Well, I think the community, and it comes out in all the polls, not very surprisingly, I think the community would scratch its head a bit about an agreement which was entirely about institutional arrangements and didn't take account of legislators.
So you would want that commitment from the Chinese unequivocally?
Well, not just me wanting it. I mean, I noticed that one of the, I think it's a slightly pejorative expression, but a pro-Peking party in Hong Kong this week, the Democratic Alliance for the Betterment of Hong Kong, expressed its anxieties about the importance of clarifying exactly what the through train would mean.
But if they clarify it and they say this, the through train means that come 1997, in our interpretation of the Basic Law, we apply a loyalty test, and if we don't judge the politicians to be loyal, then sorry, they get off the train.
Well, I don't think you can have a subjective loyalty test which is going to be applied at some time in the future and expect that to provide you with the clarity which is, I think, required.
So for you, this is a core issue to be confident that when you come back, if you get a deal, you can say to the people of Hong Kong, I believe, I have no reason not to believe, that the Chinese now are committed to allowing anyone elected in 95 to be there 4 years on.
I strongly suspect that people in Hong Kong want a real through train.
And because of that, is your bottom line as well on that?
Yes. I think that they are actually much keener on the through train concept than on some of the other things that we'll be arguing about. And I think that is going to be the really difficult question, both for Chinese officials and for me and for British government officials to answer after these talks. What sort of clarity now is there about not just the electoral process, but about electors, about legislators themselves?
That's very clear. Is it also unequivocal that the Chinese must understand that any deal, if you get a deal, will be subject to approval by the legislators in Hong Kong before it means anything?
Yeah. The Chinese officials, of course, argue, and I understand the point, that talks are between the sovereign powers, between the present sovereign and the future sovereign. They also understand that under the royal instructions, the letters patent and so on, that the Legislative Council has the responsibility for legislating. They recognise that before 1997, just as the Basic Law recognises it after 1997. I can't appear in front of the Legislative Council and say, here are arrangements for 1994 and 1995. They will exist on my fiat. I have to legislate in order to provide the arrangements and in order to get the legitimacy from the community.
And that would require a majority of the politicians in the Legislative Council?
Of course.
And if they want to modify, they are entitled under your understanding of their powers to modify.
But then we would have to be in a position in which we went back to China and explained that. I think
so. China now has a veto over what is possible in LegCo?
No. What I was saying was that if the Legislative Council modified arrangements that we'd agreed with China, we would, in the first instance, have to go back to China if we thought that was the right thing to do. There is, let me explain what I mean by that conditional sentence. The Legislative Council can't do anything which would oblige us to contravene international agreements we'd reached. For example, the joint declaration, or for example, our commitments at the UN on civil liberties. So there are some limits to what the Legislative Council can do, but I think it's recognized on all sides that the Legislative Council has to legislate.
But if, for instance, the Legislative Council were to say, well, we heard what happened up in Peking, we didn't particularly care for it, we very much liked, Governor, your original proposals, they could say, which you were going to put at LegCo in any case, they could say we're going to go for them. Do you have to go back to China then?
Well, I think it is extremely unlikely that we would reach an agreement which we didn't believe the Legislative Council would accept. So I'm rather reluctant to be lured down lots of hypothetical boulevards.
Okay. The other aspect of negotiations with China is, in the past, their longevity. In this case, you're against the clock. You've got a deadline. Have you told the Chinese that you've got a deadline?
I think if one talks about deadlines when you're starting to negotiate, they have a rather unfortunate effect of blowing up. I don't like talking about deadlines because they do sound a bit like ultimatums. But the position is quite simply this. We do need to have in place, in time, arrangements for 1994 and 95. That requires a lot of administrative work. It also requires legislation. So the calendar dictates a certain pace to these negotiations. Now, I don't want to do or say anything which makes it more difficult for those negotiations to succeed. If the negotiations are going well, then one will want to give them as much time as is required.
But you could not conceivably, given what you've said about preparing legislation, go into next year on these negotiations, could you, without running into terrible trouble?
It would create some problems if we were going on that long, and I think the community might also be wondering whether we shouldn't have settled things by then.
The community has been given the impression that July is the preferred deadline.
Well, I think that it's fair to say that the sooner the better. But I don't really want to start ringing dates in the calendar because I repeat, I think it then makes it much more difficult for our negotiators.
But we would not be wrong to suppose that if it gets beyond October, you're into serious trouble.
I think it starts to get very difficult for the district elections in particular, which are to be held next year, because candidates for those elections would really want to be starting to get to know their constituencies in the autumn of this year. So it would create considerable problems for the district elections.
Although well, let's not proceed any further, because obviously for 95 the same must apply. The nearer you get to 95, the same difficulties. Do you have the authority from the Prime Minister effectively to say, under the circumstances in which the Chinese might say, we're enjoying these talks, let's continue them. They might, you're listening to our principles, we're listening to your views, but we want to go on talking. Do you have the delegated authority to say, I'm sorry, time's up because we've got to get these proposals, whatever they're going to be, into the Legislative Council?
I think whether the talks are going very well or whether they're going less well, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary will take some notice of my views on the process. But obviously, the final responsibility is with the Prime Minister and the Cabinet.
Just to see where we've got to so far. You're going to discuss your proposals, but you're prepared to listen to what you regard as potentially better proposals. You believe that the through train, on which you've got a very clear, strong position, is of the utmost importance, and you're not going to compromise very much on that front. Legco has the final say, although you don't expect to put anything to them that you don't think they'll accept. And there is a time limit, which is coming up rapidly. Now, that's not a bottom line, but it's a pretty clear outline of where Britain is negotiating from. What makes you think there is a cat in hell's chance of the Chinese, who've been on at you as if you were the devil incarnate, precisely for the kinds of things that you believe in and for what you've been saying, are going to remotely do a deal with you?
I think it's hugely in our joint interest to have a successful outcome to these negotiations, hugely. It matters for Hong Kong, it matters for China, it matters for Britain. It matters that we're able to conduct the next 4 years as competently and decently as possible, and it matters that after that, Hong Kong's way of life is preserved.
You have to presume then that the Chinese have changed their view from the one which they have uttered with a great passion and conviction over the last 6 months, in which they have rejected your proposals, where the through train issue is one they're not prepared to discuss because it's all written in tablets of stone. What makes you think they've changed?
I think that Chinese officials recognize their own interest and recognise the important role which Hong Kong can play and will play in the further successful development of China.
And you see, your critics, the sinologists in London, former civil servants, some politicians in the business community here who are severely critical of you, say Patten lives, albeit with a good heart, in cloud cuckoo land when it comes to the Chinese.
Well, there are some of those people who find it difficult to accept that in diplomacy or negotiations you should ever have a bottom line, certainly that you should ever stand on a bottom line. There are also others who seem to have some difficulty in recognizing the relationship between the rule of law and Hong Kong's success.
If the critics are right, indeed conceivably if the critics are not right, the talks would collapse. Under those circumstances, you would presumably then put before LegCo, the Legislative Council, the proposals which are already yours and printed.
Well, I don't want to contemplate failure. I don't think that it's very sensible to set out on difficult negotiations by assuming that things are going to go wrong. But if we were unable to reach agreement with China, we're still in a position in which we have the responsibility for putting forward proposals for the 94 and 95 elections. It's not a problem that we've imagined or dreamt up. Those arrangements haven't been agreed.
Under those circumstances, which you say you don't want to contemplate, nonetheless, any serious politician has to contemplate that kind of worst case when you go into negotiations. You would end up with a very grim prospect indeed. Talks broken down, the Chinese denouncing you even more passionately if possible than they have done hitherto, setting up probably their alternative government, the so-called second stove or second kitchen, in an atmosphere poisoned by alarm and pessimism.
Well, you've sketched out there a pretty cheerful prospect. I don't actually think that I necessarily share that view. If at the end of, I hope, sincere negotiations, we weren't able to reach an agreement, I hope we could at least agree to disagree and get on with the other things in life which are important. Chinese officials do say from time to time that there's no relationship between economics and politics. I think it would be nice to have conclusive evidence of that.
In respect to the talks at this moment, do you count yourself optimistic, pessimistic?
Oh, I'm always an optimist, but a realist as well.
Governor Chris Patten, thank you very much. And now, back to John Cole in London.
Jonathan Dimbleby was speaking to Chris Patten before the first round of Anglo-Chinese talks finished in Peking yesterday. For 30 years, the policy of the militant tendency was to infiltrate the Labour Party. That was before Neil Kinnock succeeded in expelling it. Militant has just launched itself as a separate political party in England and is putting up candidates in next week's local elections. But Militant's already been out in the open for a year in Scotland, where it has been encouraged by several victories over Labour. John Rentoul has been examining the phenomenon of Scottish militant Labour.
Oh, I'd rather be a picket than a scab.
The Tories' water plans threaten our very lives.
This man has been in jail for his political activities. Tommy Sheridan, Glasgow councillor and leader of Scottish Militant Labour, is on the campaign trail. He's challenging Labour in its Scottish power base. When he stood for Militant in the general election in Glasgow, he came second to the official Labour candidate. Unusually, he was in prison at the time for not paying his poll tax. Tonight, he's come to Dundee, fighting his next fight.
Against the privatisation of Scottish water.
What privatisation of water is all about for the bosses is a financial bonanza. It's lining their pockets. Profits on the one hand to the dividend holders and big fat cheques for the private bosses. What we're saying is that we're not prepared to see that happen in Scotland.
Militant was taken on and defeated when it was inside the Labour Party. But now it has come back to haunt Labour from the outside. History suggests that political parties of the far left are doomed to electoral failure. But this Thursday, Militant is putting itself to the democratic test and hopes to win a council by-election in Dundee. As a separate socialist party, Militant now threatens Labour in its traditional strongholds, the deprived housing estates, not just here in Dundee, but throughout Scotland.
We're hoping to achieve victory. The point is that we're standing here on the traditions of struggle, of solidarity and socialism to offer an alternative to the sellout policies which are unfortunately being practised for far too long now by the political parties in Scotland, namely the Labour Party and the Scottish National Party. Scottish Militant Labour are different. We're a working class organisation of rank and file people who are saying we've had enough, we have to fight back, we want a different system, we want a different government, and we're fighting for socialism.
You can't threaten water privatisation on the heels of the poll tax without finding that there are some people who will exploit that kind of doctrinaire approach by being doctrinaire themselves, by promising, as Militant does time after time, by promising people the world in the secure knowledge that they'll never be asked to deliver it.
The council by-election in Dundee is being fought in territory favourable to Militant. Whitfield has some of the poorest housing in the city. But it's a mixed area. Many blocks of flats have recently been refurbished. The by-election was called when a Labour councillor was sent to jail on a corruption charge for trying to take bribes in return for planning permission. This creates an impression that this is a Labour rotten borough. It certainly gives the Labour candidate something to explain on the doorstep.
Mr. McCollum? Yes? Can I introduce George Barr on behalf of the Labour Party here standing on...
Labour supporters are also more disillusioned in Scotland than in England by the shock of a fourth election defeat. The Conservatives are making the best of Labour's problems, but despite holding their own in the general election, they privately don't expect to win here, nor do the Liberal Democrats, also running an active campaign. It's the Scottish National Party that would expect to benefit most from Labour's embarrassments. They have a strong local tradition here.
Hello, can I say hello? Alex Salmond, how are you?
For many years, nationalism has been the main alternative home for disillusioned Labour supporters in Scotland. But Militant has complicated the picture.
For Militant's a very simple one. I mean, their ambition is to turn Labour into a socialist party, and then for that party to win the next election. Anyway.
Militant are a threat to the nationalists as well, although they're more likely to weaken Labour to the nationalists' advantage.
We're very confident because we think our support's very secure here. But it's going to be a very good test indeed, and it's going to tell us a lot about the state of Scottish politics, because this is not a typical central Scotland seat, but nonetheless representative of a large number of areas, which Labour have traditionally held, where the SNP are challenging hard, and now we've got an intervention from Militant Labour.
But the nationalists stumbled last month. Their 3 MPs were attacked for voting with the government when it was defeated on the Maastricht Bill. This loss of face for the nationalists is Militant's gain, as the two parties compete for the disaffected Labour vote. At old-fashioned street meetings in Dundee, Militant are not remembered for what Neil Kinnock called grotesque chaos in Liverpool. They're remembered for the non-payment campaign against the poll tax in Scotland.
Okay. No, just put it in the box, yeah.
Their role in the poll tax campaign is a badge of law-breaking honour they exploit to oppose water privatisation with more verbal aggression than their rivals. Labour insists the law should be obeyed, and the SNP has yet to decide how it will oppose the sale. But Militant is committed in advance to a campaign of illegal obstruction.
I'm very confident of our ability to compete with Militant on an issue like the privatisation of Scottish water, because there's a very strong Scottish dimension to that. I mean, only 3% of people in Scotland want water in private hands, and yet we're in a situation in Scottish politics where that's seriously being canvassed as a political option by the government.
After the Militant team had gone, we came back to the estate to find out what the residents here thought of the street meeting.
Last year, the Labour that's all been in have not done nothing really. They just sit about. So you've got to let somebody else in. going to try and do something. The boy looks a young enough boy. So let him in, give him a crack at that.
Who am I supporting?
Yeah.
SNP.
Why?
Because they're good for Scotland, isn't it?
Who are you supporting in the by-election?
Labour.
Why?
I've always supported Labour. I believe in their cause.
What about the Scottish Militant? Are you impressed by them?
Not really. I'm not into militancy.
When you come into individual by-elections, it's not the false militant political prospectus that's going to be examined. It's basically the issues of housing and dampness, the real issues which affect people in these real areas. Where I think militant's false is they've got their own political agenda, which they don't talk about in these local by-elections.
Do people in Dundee really understand your ideas? I mean, they're based on Marx and Lenin and Trotsky.
Absolutely. People in Dundee, as elsewhere, understand our ideas. We should never take for granted the level of understanding of working class people. They know the difference between right and wrong, just and injustice, and they know that the capitalist system is rotten from top to bottom because the rich are getting richer while the poor are getting poorer. They want to turn that on its head. That's what we want to do, and that's why we're getting support for those ideas.
But you don't advertise the fact that you're revolutionary socialists.
We advertise the fact quite clearly that we want to change the system.
The Labour Party and its affiliated trade unions are the political establishment in Scotland, and there are signs that they're responding to the militant threat. Last week at the Scottish Trades Union Congress, the emphasis was on the bread and butter issues of industry and jobs.
The Tories want to reposition Britain as a labour market in Europe and across the world. In effect, to convert us into a kind of industrial discount store where labour is cheap and social standards low.
In fact, there's a shift taking place in Scottish Labour politics as Tom Clark plays down Home Rule for Scotland in favour of putting Labour's case on the kind of issues that Militant is pressing on the doorsteps.
I think it's important that we relate the case for a Scottish Parliament to our policy on jobs, our policies on the health service, our demands on education, and our attack on poverty. And I think the more that we do that, the more the Scottish people will feel that we're right in our commitment to deliver a Scottish Parliament.
The big industrial issue in Scotland at the moment is the Timex dispute. By coincidence, a national news story on the doorstep of the Dundee by-election. Most of the workforce at Timex were sacked while on strike against pay cuts. Labour urges negotiation, while Militant is prominent in the weekly mass picket. And Tommy Sheridan was arrested here last month.
Political parties showed support for Timex here today, do you reckon?
Militant believes workers will be radicalised by strikes to reject conventional politics. Every morning for 13 weeks, 2 unmarked grey buses have picked up replacement workers in Dundee and driven them through the picket line. Militant does have a line which appeals to some people in Dundee, which points out that the Labour Party has accepted a lot of trade union law reform put through by the Conservative government.
I think that's exactly the sort of thing that Militant would say, wouldn't they? What they fail to accept or fail to explain is that because times change, it would be absurd. It would be absurd for the Labour Party to fight the next election on the same programme as we fought in 1979.
Perhaps time has stood still in parts of Dundee and similar places across Scotland because Militant is a threat to Labour. Militant has already won 6 council seats in Glasgow and may also open the way for the Nationalists by taking votes from Labour. Militant's success in Scotland has exposed the weakness at the core of Labour's electoral base.
The anguish of Bosnia has produced strange political bedfellows at Westminster. When Douglas Hurd, defending the government's reluctance to lift the arms embargo or launch airstrikes, quotes Tony Benn, you can tell that party lines are shattered. Those like Ben and Dennis Healy, who served in the last war, are noticeably less inclined towards military options. The Foreign Secretary, with a round of backbench meetings, steadied